Hi folks, Nathan Pierce here with Family Protection Ministries. I'm excited to share with you a few things today. But before we get started, I wanted to just remind all of us, as it says in Psalms, that God remains on his throne, and no matter what's going on around us, we can have our confidence in that. So let's get into it. Welcome to the Front Line with FPM, where we talk about California politics, homeschool freedom, parental rights, and the family. I'm your host, Nathan Pierce, and thanks for joining us today. Let's jump right in and see what's going on here on the front line. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the presidential debate and some things going on there and how we can be thinking about these things. But also I want to get into a couple of education and policy issues. But let's go ahead and get started with the debate. So the debate between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris was kind of a surprise to many. It was an encouragement to many, and it was a discouragement to many. But regardless of how you feel about how the debate itself went, how are we supposed to think about these things and how they go? And I just want to help us to sort of put these things in perspective. Ultimately, we should be engaged in our election process. We should be engaged in what's going to be on that ballot, because essentially the government is asking you a question. What do you think we should do? And ultimately the question is, what direction should our government go and who should run it? And the decision is up to you, along with everyone else that's a registered voter in the United States. But how do we think about how to answer those questions? And ultimately, I think it's important for us to recognize that we have a responsibility to do good to our fellow man. It is important to reflect God's truth and to be a light for what truth is in our society today, since there is so much confusion about what is truth. And ultimately, there is a decision that's placed upon the shoulders of voters, and you are part of that group of people that gets to make those decisions. So when we are asked who should run the country, who should be making decisions for each of us, who should be laying out the framework that is going to impact our children and our children's children for the future, we need to be engaged in making those decisions, and voting is important. Now, not only is voting itself important, but as was pointed out by Senator Ochoa Bogue at our recent Homeschool Freedom Day down in San Diego, it's important for us to get involved in the voting process itself, not just make our vote, make sure that we fill out our ballot in a way that reflects accurately what God has designed for government and how God would want us to be making these decisions for government. But also, we should be involved in the process itself, and that means that we can volunteer for voting, vote watching, or being involved in counting votes or overseeing how voting gets counted in our local areas. And that's something that's not difficult to do. You can get in touch with your registrar of voters at your local county office of elections and see what you can do to help. Volunteer and be a person that is part of having oversight of a fair election process. So that's something to remember. It's important. It's important just like placing your vote is important. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those options, how you can be involved there. Ultimately, when we look at elections, we can be very discouraged. We can be encouraged at some times and other times be discouraged. But no matter what happens in elections, we do need to remember that God is sovereign. He does remain on the throne. And to emphasize this a little, in addition to some of the scriptures that we could go into here, that we've actually put in our recent newsletter that you'll be getting in your mailbox in a week or two, I would encourage you to take a look at a book that came out by Steve Lawson not too long ago. And I just want to draw your attention to some thoughts in here. And I'm going to read a few paragraphs to you right here in the podcast. I'm going to start. He says in this chapter, Supremely Reigning. The book is called Show Me Your Glory by Steve Lawson. And I think it's a really encouraging and helpful book in how we think about things in the big picture. But he says, the sovereignty of God is like a soft pillow upon which the believer lays his head at night. There is no attribute more comforting to God's children than the sovereignty of their Father. Under our most adverse circumstances, we believe that sovereignty has ordained our afflictions. In the most severe trials, we trust that God has a purpose, and behind that purpose is his master plan. Even in our darkest valleys, we must rely on this foundational truth that divine sovereignty is using it as a part of a far greater design for his glory and our good. In the lowest ebb of life, we may remain confident that God will use these difficulties to sanctify us. We are convinced that nothing lies outside God's control. All things are moving forward by the inscrutable mystery of his eternal will. His supreme authority remains operative. His timing is perfect. His hand remains on us for good. All things, both good and bad, both prosperity and adversity, are being directed by God for a far greater good. If it was not for the sovereignty of God, we would despair. But because he remains on his throne, ruling over every storm of life, we remain full of hope, knowing it is all under his guidance. So hopefully that will give you some hope and will remind you of God's faithfulness and his hand that is on all things, including elections. So with that, I want to transition to policy. There's a couple of things I want to mention today. One happens to be our California legislature has had an extraordinary session, which means that even though they ended their session for the year, they had an extra session, which is means that's not part of the regular session of the year, but they called a special session afterwards and said, let's talk about some things. In this particular case, it had to do with fuels, and we've been monitoring that extra session and to make sure that it doesn't have any negative impact on private homeschooling or the family. And ultimately, it does have some impact on cost because they're dealing with the cost of fuel. And so we're looking at those things, but ultimately it does not impact homeschool freedom. So just wanted to give you an update on that. The legislature is, in a sense, back in session, but they're not so far talking about anything that impacts homeschool freedom. So we're still busy at it, even though they're supposed to have been on break. But we'll keep you posted on anything that is concerning there. Finally, I want to mention a report from South Carolina. South Carolina Supreme Court has ruled that a 2023 law allowing parents to spend taxpayer money on private schools violates the state constitution. Ultimately, there were a number of court cases that went through the court system there, and there were these policies in South Carolina that allowed parents to take some money from the government that could be used for private education. Nearly 3,000 students, according to the article, have already been awarded $1,500 each under the program, but the court won't require it to be paid back if spent on private school tuition or fees. The case was argued before the High Court in March, well before the money was distributed. The South Carolina law is part of a nationwide movement. Groups that study the programs reported that at least 16 states have some form of the vouchers. Now, this is an issue that's been debated throughout the state of California and across the nation of taking government funds and putting it towards private education. And in this case, the state Supreme Court of South Carolina determined that even though they passed this law in their state, it violates the state constitution to implement it because it's allowing the state to fund private education, which has their own ability to spend the money how they see fit. They function in their department. The private schools are able to function how they want to, separate from government schools, and so government doesn't want their money being used to fund private education. The same has been sort of the reasoning in California why that hasn't moved forward here in our state. So we need to always be aware that with state funds comes state regulation, and in this case of South Carolina, they're saying there's not enough state regulation to govern how this money gets used, so it's therefore a violation of the state constitution there, which would be the case here in California if something similar were to be passed. It's always better to go without state money and state regulation, because the more state regulation you get, the less freedom we have here in our state. So that being said, hope you have a great rest of your week. I will be coming to you from Nashville next week, as I'll be with a group of state leaders getting together to go through various legislative proposals and attacks on homeschooling. We'll be encouraging each other, and so I would ask for your prayers for that. That's happening in Nashville, and we would appreciate your prayers for that as we try to encourage one another and also come up with strategies to battle the latest round and future rounds of attacks on homeschool freedoms in the United States and around the world. And lastly, one final story I wanted to share with you has to do, it was a Wall Street Journal article, "Your kid's classroom now has better decor than your living room." The funny thing about this is that it seems like they're trying to copy homeschooling in public schools. Listen to this. "Gen Z teachers are going all out to decorate, but some say it's too much. It looks like West Elm for kids." So this one part of the story is talking about how classrooms are so heavy and you don't want to be there, and they're dark and gloomy, and it's a sterile environment, and you don't really enhance somebody's learning experience by being in a gray and white room. And so people are starting to change that. Teachers are starting to change that, which I think is a great idea. This one teacher, her classroom in northern Idaho is now bathed in brown, cream, and beige for a homey, cozy feeling. As the 27-year-old teacher puts it, thrifted bohemian rugs, groovy flower pillows, wicker baskets, and a mod green armchair round out the ambiance. "I have been in boring classrooms where you can't wait to leave," she says. "But a decorated classroom that's outside the norm is fun and inspiring, and it can affect the way they learn." The interesting thing that I thought was a great way to point out the irony here is that one of my interns here in the office said, "Isn't there a type of school that does that already? In other words, homeschooling, a place that kids learn and it feels like a home because it actually is one." Well, I think it's pretty nice that teachers are actually recognizing that kids learn best in a home type environment. And I would happen to agree with that. As our studies have shown, kids learn best when they learn at home. And it's not that you can emulate the home and make it perfect at a school, but at least teachers are finding that they learn at least a little better if you make the school classroom feel more homey. So for all of you who are trying to make your home look more like a school, you might reconsider. As a t-shirt that one of my siblings used to wear many years ago, it said, "Kids learn best in the nest." And I think that's so true. Always has been, always will be. That's it for today. Hope you have a great week. Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Front Line with FPM. For more information about the topics we discuss here, check out Family Protection Ministries at fpmca.org and subscribe to our channel.